Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast on YouTube. My name is Carey Nieuwhof, and my goal is to help you lead like never before. So what I do every week is I sit down with world-class leaders and church leaders, business leaders, and I talk to them about what made them who they are and try to have the conversation with them that you would have if you got to sit down for lunch with them or have dinner with them or really got to spend some time with them. So we go into the backstory and we explore what made them who they are and some of the principles they've learned along the way. So if you enjoy this episode, I would love for you to like it, to subscribe, and also to share it with your friends. And in the meantime, here's today's episode. Rob, it's such a thrill to have you on the podcast. Welcome.
Thanks, Carey. I've so enjoyed your lessons on leadership. I commute in California up the 405, so your podcast is such an inspiration. And it's interesting because I feel like sometimes I learn as much from the guests as I do your questions. You give such amazing questions. And of course, things are all over the map, from executive at Chick-fil-A or Anne Graham Lotz telling stories about the dinner time table, or a bakery in the Rust Belt. But, just picking up little nuggets that you can incorporate into your own leadership is such a gift. And so much of that is provided through your lens. So we all appreciate you so much.
Rob, I'll tell you, it was a thrill to find out that you were a listener. I mean, that was a pretty exciting day for me. And as I shared with you, I have a lot of friends who wish they were me today. And as I confessed to you, I know who the Lakers are. I know who Kobe Bryant is. I know LeBron James, but I'm not a sports guy. So there's a lot of people I've got my doors locked just in case I get taken over for this interview. But it's a thrill. And I don't know whether you find this or not, but I find that great leadership for me is really eclectic, and it comes from very unlikely sources. Is that similar to your journey? We want to focus on your story, but do you love learning from left field, right field, just even non-sport stuff? It's wow, like you mentioned, the Mark who has that bakery in Oakmont, Pennsylvania, right? Yeah, exactly. That was a couple of years ago on the show, but I just learned so much from him. And having been to that bakery, you have to go sometime, Rob. You really do.
No, I think the lens of leadership is such a broad mosaic. And you mentioned Kobe, of course, just such a dear friend, but he grew up in Italy. As the listeners probably know, he had a lot of years over there. So he just developed this curiosity, almost as like a Renaissance man, to dig into things really deeply. So, he would go and study Michelangelo, and how he did a statue, or study a Da Vinci painting and incorporate that into his basketball game. So having been best friends with him for 20 years, you get this curiosity about life that draws you into all sorts of different places to develop your leadership lens. And your program has done that for me. I think of the places my friendship with him brought me. I remember there was one time, Carey, where he was trying to formulate a new aspect of his game and the way he moved on the court. And he was drawing inspiration from how great white sharks attacked. And so, seriously? I get a call from Kobe, and he says, "Hey, I want to take a boat out to the Farallon Islands," which is 20, it's a long boat ride off of the coast of Mexico. And, before you know it, we're out there in a cage watching these massive creatures just swim around us. And he's studying how that may, affect how he moves around on the court and how he attacks the basket. So, passion and leadership and learning can come from so many things in life.
Wow, that's fascinating. So you went out with him into the ocean to watch these sharks move.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll never forget that moment. It was a trip of a lifetime. He's extraordinarily patient, and he's also a genius. So he's got all this stuff that he's studied about him, and we're down there for an hour. And I remember looking out. The water's cold, and you're in a cage, and minutes are slow when you're looking out into the unknown. And there was one point in time after an hour, of course, with my patience level, I was ready to go up and say, "Hey, great trip, great adventure." We didn't see anything, but all of a sudden, the ether opened like a curtain, and this, 15-foot great white shark just comes out of nowhere right up to the cage. And, it was a holy moment when you see something like that.
No kidding. Yeah, and a little, I would think a little bit, scary as well when you realize you're that close to one of the forces of nature. So I got to ask, on behalf of all the basketball fans, did he learn? Like, what did he learn? Did he change his move? What was his observation that day?
He did. I mean, it's for him, it was a thing of pace. So like if you watch athletes move, sometimes they move steadily and sometimes they explode and move quickly. And if you look at how a great white shark attacks a seal, they kind of methodically circle it and come up and then they pounce, so it was all about movement. But, I remember with him too, reading Walter Isaacson's book on Da Vinci, and just how if Da Vinci was going to paint a hummingbird, he wouldn't just look at it and paint it. He would dissect it and build it from the inside out. And I think when you look at things through that lens and that level of detail, you learn so much more. And I think that's what the geniuses in life, inspire us with. I was telling you before we jumped on, we have a thing at the Lakers called the Lakers Genius Talks, where I try to bring in outside leaders and speakers to talk to our team, to LeBron James and Anthony Davis, because the best way to learn isn't always just, hey, the basketball coach is teaching you basketball. It's how do we dimensionalize our lives? And one of our speakers was Elon Musk, who's a fascinating inventor and SpaceX and Tesla. And I remember one of our players said to him, as a leader, how do you stay ahead of the competition? And his answer was so fascinating. I mean, in typical genius style, he kind of thought for a second, had his hand on his chin. He was pensive. And then he said, if you're making rockets that do things that NASA can't do, and you're making electric cars that can drive themselves while the others are still filling their cars up at the gas station, you don't really have to worry about the competition. You just have to be great at what you do. And, the room just went silent.
Wow. Yeah, you think about him because he's a subject of fascination for me too. I've read this multiple places, but you can't always trust the internet. Like he's building a whole I guess he's now moving to Texas if you can believe that, but he's building a whole underground system of roads in California to solve the traffic problem. Is that do you know anything about that? Or
there's been talk of that. Because of the pandemic, traffic in California has been lighter, but when it's heavy, an underground tunnel would be great. But but some of the leaders we brought in, I remember Denzel Washington. Of course, he's an Academy Award winning, amazing actor, one of the greatest, and he sits courtside to a lot of Lakers games. And he came and he filmed, Training Day, where he was this, hardcore character with a killer edge and used foul language and, was kind of a nasty, edgy character. And we've talked about, how do you set your mindset to compete, as an athlete? What's the right frame of mind to get in? So we asked him a question. We said, when you were trying to get into that character for Training Day, how did you in the morning kind of get in that edgy, nasty mindset so you became authentic and real? And his answer was stunning. Carey, he looked at the room and he said, well, the way that I got into character for that particular character that he won, I think he won an Oscar for that one. He said, what I would do is I would, in my hotel room on set, but before I went to bed at night, I would take my shoes and I would put them deep underneath my bed so that the next morning I know that I need to get up and start my day on my knees in humility and prayer. Wow. And I was like, wow, you would think he would be boxing or, doing something hardcore, but he emptied himself and kind of started his day in humility to kind of take on that role, which is fascinating.
Well, I love your curiosity and your lifelong learning. I want to go back a couple of decades to 1996. So you played some very, very serious basketball with Michigan, but you were also fairly serious about schooling. And from what I know, often it's kind of you're going to do athletics or you're going to do school, but you graduated cum laude with a JD, a Juris Doctor. So you're a lawyer. And I'm curious as to why you decided to take law so seriously, because you were a hyper competitive athlete and Michigan did really, really well when you were at Michigan. So I'd love to know what made you pursue law as seriously as you did, because you did clerkship and the whole deal.
It's a great question, Carey. I think sometimes when, God's faithfulness seems to be most clear when you look through the review mirror of life and you see how he kind of pieces your story together.
Yeah.
And early on in life, I was raised in Illinois, just in a small town. And early on, both my dad, who was a coach and teacher, and my mom, who was a nurse, we had humble origins. He was a public school teacher. But early on, they really drove home in me. If you pursue excellence with three things, with sports, pursue excellence in that, with your education, and then with your faith. That's just those are great pillars to start your journey. And so I kind of took that to heart, and didn't have a particular passion about the law until I was recruited to play basketball, and was extraordinarily blessed to be on a national championship team at the University of Michigan. But when I started my journey at college, at university, I was matched with a mentor who was a law school professor, who was a student advisor, and his name was Professor Douglas Kahn, and he was is an extraordinary human in that he really centered his life around serving others and just giving. I mean, he was a master chess player and won ping pong titles, just an extraordinary human being. But he centered his life on his students and on me. He and his wife would have me over for dinners and talk about the law and talk about the Constitution, and just really burst this curiosity about law school. And so when I was done, I graduated from the business school. And then when I was finished getting that degree, which I knew was something I wanted to do, I was faced with, hey, do I go on and try to play professional ball, either in the States or overseas? But I felt like I really wanted to honor Professor Kahn and be one of his students. And the University of Michigan Law School is one of the top in the world. And when I applied and got in, I wanted to give back. And it set me down this path, of eventually getting into being a sports agent and now a general manager of the Lakers.
Yeah, so we touched on it a little bit, but you represented a number of NBA players, particularly Kobe Bryant. You were very well known for being his longtime agent, his friend, worked with him until his sad, tragic, untimely death a while back. We touched on this already, but I'm sure this could be a whole episode in and of itself. What were some of the qualities, habits, and disciplines that made Kobe the man and the player that he was?
Listen, Carey, since the tragedy of January 26th, there isn't really a moment of the day where I don't think about Kobe's influence and Gianna's influence, his daughter, who was also our goddaughter. They inspire me every day, and they are some of the greatest gifts of my life's journey. And I think, it's interesting when Kobe played, so Kobe played 20 years for the Lakers and of course won 5 world championships and multiple MVPs and gold medals. And I remember, he was a best friend. And I remember when he was retired, I had a great opportunity to, have a dinner with him, or, just sitting on couches, maybe having a glass of wine or something. And I asked him, I said, I was like, hey, looking back on those 20 years and one of the great sports careers in the history of the world, like, is there anything maybe you would have done a little bit different or better? That was late night conversations. And I was really moved by his answer, because he said, he's like, not a whole lot, but maybe one thing is empathy. And again, he's known as the Black Mamba, kind of, that, again, killer mentalities. You wouldn't expect that to be his answer. And then he kind of unpacked it a little bit. He said, when you start, I started as an 18-year-old. He said, you kind of have a my way or the highway lens on leadership, because you think you know it all, and you come in and you expect everybody to think like you, to play like you, and to analyze the world like you. And there's lessons of leadership here. But he said, as I matured and got, in the second half of my career towards the end, I realized how important it was as a leader to have the quality of empathy. And he said, what I mean by that is, how do I get the most out of my teammates? Like, they're not all like me. I have to understand. There was one player named Pau Gasol who was one of Kobe's great friends and an all-star player. And he had a European upbringing in Spain and he had a different set of life circumstances. And Kobe had to kind of tap into him to make him great. And so he had to start thinking more like him. He had to understand his past. And I think that's so important on any team that we're involved in, is understanding other people's lens, their story, and having empathy. And when Kobe did that, he won 3 championships with Shaq, but then he also won 2, sort of on his own. And he said the key to winning that second set was that quality, understanding his teammates and how to make them great.
One of the things, because you were an agent for a number of years, and I don't think that, your job is still negotiation. We're going to talk about trades you made in the off season after winning the world championship, et cetera, et cetera. But leadership is a lot of negotiation. So I'm a law school grad as well. My favorite course was lawyer as negotiator, that and constitutional law. But that negotiation course, I still think about all the time. What are some of the best strategies that you have discovered for negotiation?
Gosh, Carey, that's a good question too. I think as an agent, I was able to negotiate, for 20 years, and now as a general manager, I think, early on, I think that there was a way of doing business that that was sort of, hey, you had to win the deal, and that didn't necessarily, work. I think if you go into a negotiation with sort of like a scorched earth mentality, like, I need to get everything and the other person needs to get on their knees, I really think that's going to not lead to maybe the best result. I've tried to do things as an agent and as a general manager more through a partnership lens and a lens of collaboration. Oftentimes when I'm negotiating a deal with another general manager in the NBA or with a player agent, you're going to have to come back and be at the table over and over with them on other deals. And so I think both parties want to walk away and say, hey, this was an effective partnership lens and it benefited both of us. And so I think, again, if you can approach it that way, you'll probably get a way better result. And then I think the other thing I've learned is, maybe some of the negotiating books would say, oh, hold your ace card, or, don't show the other side what you're thinking. I would say probably more of a transparency lens leads to more productive deals and partnerships. If you really approach it that way, oftentimes you'll hear leaders say, well, I just need to do what's best for the organization. And I get that to some extent, but how about I need to do what's best for all the parties involved here. Maybe that's a broader lens.
Yeah, that strikes me as intuitively correct and generous. You have a very nice demeanor about you, Rob. Like you don't come across as, I'm going to get this, or here we go. Can you explore that a little bit more? Because I think that's missing. One of the things that's really bothering me is how tribalized and divided our culture has been. And I think that idea of empathy you were talking about with Kobe Bryant, and then, can you flesh that out? Like, is there, without telling tales out of school, is there a scenario you can think of where that ended up working out really well to the level you're comfortable sharing details? I'd just love to know, put some bones on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I guess if you think about it, so not just for me, but if you're a general manager of a sports franchise, and you are trying to win a championship, the absolute key ingredient to that in any sport, whether it's hockey or baseball or basketball, is getting great players. You can have the greatest general manager and the greatest coach to keep myself in a frame of humility, I tell myself every morning, like, a team can have a great general manager and a great coach, but if their players aren't good, they're going to be 0 wins, 80 losses. Gotta have good players. And so I guess just to put meat on the bones of your question, if let's say I'm negotiating with a player agent and it's maybe just on a basketball team, there's 5 starters, and maybe this negotiation happens to be for the 12th man on the team.
Right.
So maybe someone that's not going to play a pivotal role, but the negotiation goes really, really well with the agent. He felt like he was dealt with honorably and fairly and kindly. Well, then fast forward, what if a year later that agent represents a player that's a superstar and is a free agent and says, gosh, that went really well. I think this is an organization I can trust. They're transparent. They treat me with integrity and openness and kindness. Maybe that relationship capital and that glue puts you to the front in signing that player who can become a franchise changing player. So it's building up that social capital and that relationship capital. I think that ultimately helps in the end.
Yeah, that's a good point, right? Because you're negotiating for the 12th person, but that agent represents numerous people, and so you really have to think about treating people fairly. What about dealing with like the Kobe's or the LeBron Jameses? And you weren't LeBron's agent, but you obviously brought him onto the Lakers, et cetera. When you're dealing with talent that large, are there any different principles, strategies, or approaches that are more helpful or less helpful?
What's interesting, Carey? So for 20 years, I was on the player agent side. And so you're an advocate for players. And in those 20 years, I was able to learn so much about how players think and what they need. And so I think what we've been able to do now is to take all those experiences where now I'm on the team side. And so we've tried to create a culture at the Lakers that says we want to be there to serve all the needs of the players and make sure they're getting actually everything they need. And because of those experiences I had before, we're able to identify those things. And the Lakers, if you go back, 3 or 4 years, we were really in a period of losing a ton and couldn't turn it around. And then we really, I've been working there for 3 years. And when we got hired, it was how do we create this culture of service, of getting everything that the players need. And, like I said earlier, you've had other leaders on podcasts, like Chick-fil-A comes out. Like that's one, it's all about the customers. How do we make the customers feel good? And I think it's that same thread, is at the Lakers. How do we create a culture where the players feel like this is the team I want to play for? Their leadership, they're servant oriented. I think that's really important.
Yeah, and so let's go there. Let's talk about that. Because if my research is correct, was it a franchise worst 6-year playoff drought for the Lakers when they hired you?
Yeah. We were in a drought, and I remember when I got the job. Again, I had a dinner with Kobe, and he was like, I know how detail oriented, process oriented you are, and he said, I'll give you 2 or 3 years, and you'll have the Lakers back to a championship level. So I had no idea at the time. I was like, you got to be kidding me! But it was such a blessing. I think we played in a bubble, Carey. So we won the 2020 World Championship, and because of the pandemic, we were forced to do it in a bubble in Orlando, Florida, where it was 100 days of testing and all sorts of crazy things that the world will never know. Difficult to be away from family and in a hotel for 100 nights. But again, I think in that environment where it's mentally taxing, it's emotionally taxing, I felt like the team that was going to come out in the end with the World Championship trophy was probably the team and the players that were getting the best service from the organization. Because life goes on when you're in a medical bubble. Family members get married, people pass away, all sorts of stuff is going on, and players are experiencing these things. And how are you coming around them to support them? So
what would you do? What would you do to support players? What are some practical examples of how you create that culture?
I think it's availability. It's time. I remember one of the players, had a sister that was getting married, and if he went to the wedding, then he'd have to come back and quarantine for 14 days and miss a ton of games. So it's let's unpack what that means, and can we recreate on the other side of the bubble some way for you to celebrate with your sister that maybe the Lakers can be a part of, to kind of recreate that moment. And that was a redemptive thing where ultimately we won the championship, and the NBA allowed family members to come, and his sister was able to come and see her brother win a championship.
Oh, wow.
So that got redeemed. But I mean, players would, in the middle, there was no, laundry mats there or anything like that. So in the middle of the night, I'd get a text like, hey, I'm out of like my t-shirts and boxers. How do I get X, Y, and Z? And, it's just, okay, we want to help you with whatever you need. We want to make this smooth. It's the little things that matter. And I think players know when they feel cared for, just like customers, they know when they feel cared for.
How did that become your approach?
Well, I think it goes back to that mosaic of life. I mean, I think all of your learnings, over the years, I think, clearly as a person of faith, I think, I think of an author like Kathleen Norris who says, it's like, don't call yourself a person of faith. Don't call yourself a Christian or call yourself Jewish or whatever. Let other people see those qualities in you. And I think when as a Christian, in my case, just the qualities we learn about in the gospel of service and humility and compassion and empathy, if you can really put those into your life and others can see it, like St. Francis of Assisi says, preach and only use words if you have to. I think, living that way, if people see that, it's so impactful. And, I try to orient myself to that every morning. I think we all have probably different practices with how we start the day, but for me, with a 12-year-old son and a 10-year-old daughter and being married, the early hours have become precious, 5 a.m. and getting up. And for me, it's reorienting our mindset to those qualities every day and looking at life through the lens of, hey, I have the privilege of being an instrument in God's hands. And how are you going to use this day? Like, the last thing I want to do is put myself at the center of this day and my plans, because then it's going to go horribly wrong. But if I can empty myself and just be an instrument, then man, the day takes on an adventure. And so for me, that's starting with meditation and journaling and scripture. And, I used to look at it maybe when I was in high school or college, the Richard Foster, spiritual disciplines, and these are the things you have to do. But now for me, it's like, I can't wait to get up because it's a gift and I can't go without it. Just starting my day that way. And
it's kind of life support, isn't it, Rob?
It really is. It really is, Carey.
I hear you. So let's go back a couple of years. The Lakers haven't won. They're not living up to their reputation, their potential. You get brought in. What are some of the first changes you made? So you're serving people. You're like, we're going to look after all the players. What were some of the other, like looking back on it, the key moments that led to the World Championship in 2020?
Yeah, so it was creating that culture. I don't need to revisit that. But the other thing then is, building a sports team is, I used this analogy the other night, watching a Netflix show about chess playing. It was a master chess player. It's this show.
Oh, is that Queen's Gambit?
Yeah, the Queen.
Yeah, we're working through that right now too.
Yeah. So, and really like building a roster and a coaching staff, it's how do I assemble all of these chess pieces on the board for it to be an effective game? And part of that is there's 30 teams in the NBA. So you've got to study 29 other teams' chess boards because you're going to be playing against them, right? And so you've got to analyze their pieces and how they fit together and how they move around. And then your own in terms of how you build a roster. And it's complicated because there's a salary cap, meaning you can only spend so much money, and you've really got to be smart with how you put all that together. But for us, the first thing I started, working with Magic Johnson, who was the president of the team and a great, great friend, an amazing person. And the first thing we needed to do was kind of clear the deck. And there were a lot of pieces on the board that maybe weren't providing the value we needed. So we had to get them off and kind of create what's called salary cap space to rebuild the team. And so there was a process of kind of, cleaning house a little bit at the beginning and then bringing in the players that we thought stood for what the Lakers' excellence and championship level basketball is. And it took a little bit of time to do it. I don't think anyone expected us to win a championship in our third year. But I look back on 2020 and it just feels like in many ways, God's hand was on this season. Of course, there was the extraordinary tragedies around January 26th. There was the social unrest and things that our nation was going through, the world was going through, the pandemic. And I do see this title as having redemptive pieces to some of those really, really hard things. So that work that was put in 2-3 years ago, leading to this, certainly feels like grace.
So one of your jobs is you manage a lot of egos, a lot of talent, millions, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars. What are some keys to navigating all of that? Because that's really complicated.
Yeah, it really is. I think it gets really down to mindset and sort of how you're carrying yourself through the day. In the medical bubble of Orlando, I read N.T. Wright's book on the Apostle Paul.
Oh yeah, that's a thick book, man. You had a lot of time.
And so much of his conclusions in that biography about Paul are that Paul spent an extraordinary amount of time teaching us about where we center our thoughts. And holding thoughts captive and thinking of heavenly things. And just so much of our day, I think, especially as leaders, we're attacked with complexities and things are being flashed at us. And it's how are we managing our thought life and making sure that we're holding our thought life accountable to the principles we want to live by. And I think that's really, really important in leadership positions. And has been helpful, to me in so many ways. And it's something I think about throughout my day.
So what do you do when your value system, and I'm getting a picture of your value system in this conversation, but not everybody on a team would buy into that. There's some guys who are like, no, Rob, I'm the deal. All right. You pay me X, $1 million a year. And my face is all over ESPN every night. And I'm the league leader. How do you get that to gel in a team setting when not everybody shares those values?
I think it's it's definitely how you live it out. It's bringing in other people that you feel like share those same qualities. We have a head coach who he's a really optimistic person. His thought life is very optimistic. A lot of coaches can be, cantankerous or finger pointers, but we identified him, and this is a good anecdotal story that'll let you into his lens. So we won the world championship in mid-October of 2020. And then as soon as I got home, I hadn't seen my family, for 100 days, which is hard. It gave you a deeper sense of appreciation for members of the military and, people that are away from their family long term. But I got home, and then the way the NBA calendar worked because of this pandemic is we had to quickly turn to the NBA draft to draft players, and then quickly turn to NBA free agency to re-sign contracts and build the team again for the 2021 season. And I had a number of people around me saying, gosh, you're working so hard on the other side of the bubble. You don't even get to savor the 2020 championship and the rings and the banner. Like you're throwing yourself right into 2021. And I shared that with our coach, Coach Vogel, who's the optimist. And again, it's a mindset thing. And he said, oh, don't buy into that mindset. He said, we get to savor the Lakers 2020 World Championship forever. And so, I think to answer your question, it's like surrounding yourself with people that share those qualities and kind of have the same mindset, I think is really, really important. Really important.
Anything else you learned in the Orlando bubble, the 100-day quarantine, the playing under those conditions that you think might speak into your future leadership when things move into more sane times? Like anything that you're like, oh, that was a great lesson.
Yeah, just how incredibly powerful proximity to others and community and togetherness is in leadership. You can't lead from an ivory tower. If you think about it, we were in a hotel And so you get up in the morning, and to your right maybe is the team medical trainer. To your left is LeBron James. Down the hall is the head equipment guy getting the uniforms ready. And it felt like a college campus, but the closeness and the daily togetherness as we were kind of going into the games and the wins and losses was probably something that will never get duplicated in sports again, because we all go home to our houses and get in our cars and leave the game. But in this case, it's like, let's get on the bus and go back to the hotel together. And so even though, again, from a mindset perspective, even though there were some things that the pandemic caused us to lose with the 2020 World Championship, like a parade for all the Lakers fans, which would have brought 1 million people into the streets, there were also extraordinarily things gained, like just the shared experience of going through a world championship on a daily basis in a hotel together. I think that's a book that maybe someday gets written that I don't think other sports teams will ever experience. So there were some gifts. And then for me, I think the other thing I learned coming out of the bubble, when you don't have the distractions and the comforts of like family, or taking your dog on a walk around the block, or the things that you can kind of take a break from being on and work. Because in the bubble, there was no break.
Right.
If you left to go outside, there was another team and their coach, and you're kind of on having a conversation about the game. If you went around the corner, maybe some of your colleagues would be there. There was no escape. It was 100 days of work environment. And so I really realized how important those things are to a holistic approach to leadership, to be able to come home into the comforts of your kids, your family, reading a book by the fire, taking your dog on a walk. One of the graces in that is, I have a 12-year-old son and he plays basketball. And so my points of connection with him are off the chart. We can always find commonality. And then my 10-year-old daughter has a whole different wiring, and she likes time with dad. And I was praying before the bubble a lot, maybe for a year, of gosh, God, I want to see new ways to connect with Emery. And it's so easy with my son Durham. And when we were separated for 100 days, we got to get reunited in the bubble. There was actually the hotel, and then there was this wooden bridge out to a little restaurant where you could eat. And they allowed the families, when we won the championship, to meet us at that restaurant after the game to celebrate. So I hadn't seen my family for 100 days. And I'll never forget, the dock was kind of long to the restaurant. And I was like, I got off the bus at the hotel, and I knew my family was waiting in the restaurant. And I started kind of jogging down the dock, and my 10-year-old daughter, it's almost like a scene out of the movie or something. She left the restaurant and she came sprinting towards me, and about halfway jumped up and hugged me and started crying. And she's not an emotional. She started crying, and she was like, Daddy, I never want to live life again without you. And, it's that moment. We've had this just unbelievable connection on the other side of the bubble. So just, sometimes, as we all know, you can go through extraordinarily different circumstances and hard circumstances in life, but it can lead to these unexpected graces that just come, and they're from the Lord.
That's awesome. You have done something that the vast majority of listeners haven't, which is to win a world championship and to be at that place. I think we've all had moments of victory that we're like, oh, wow, we finally did whatever was on our list to do, right? What were some of the unique joys and some of the unique challenges or surprises that come with winning at the highest level?
Yeah, I've listened to some of your other extraordinary podcasts. I know the other day Beth Moore was talking about social media and sort of the praise and criticism and living with that. And when you're in a position of professional sports, especially for a brand like the Lakers, that is a world-renowned brand all over the globe, the players, the head coach, and the general manager, they become under the fire of public scrutiny and sports radio talk. And so at the beginning of this, I remember I kind of I made a vow to my wife, Kristen. I said, hey, I think it's going to be really, really important that we hold each other accountable, that, when the times are good and you're getting the praise and people are saying wonderful things, is to not tune into that, because then you're going to get big-headed and prideful. And we all know what that leads to, arrogance and all those awful qualities. At the same time, when the critics come out, and I've been through that side as well, like any public figure, and the attacks come, is to not buy into those and then start to get discouraged or self-doubting. So really stay away from those polls, and where do we find ourselves committed to? It's the work. Just get lost in the process of the work and try to block that noise out as much as possible. And for me on the championship run in the bubble, it was interesting, Carey, because you'd play these, incredible games and everyone in the world's watching, and you'd get back to your hotel room, and if it was a loss, it would feel like the end of the world, especially, the NBA finals, because you didn't have anyone to comfort and console you. And I just had to kind of get into this place where I had put my plans for the Lakers kind of at the center. And God had a lesson to teach me, which is, it's thy will be done, not my will be done. And I had really put, my Lakers GM, like, this is how it should happen. I know this is what you want, God. at the center, and quickly learned, when I was able to surrender that to more of a thy will be done mindset, that's when the beautiful things started happening. So that was definitely a learning lesson in the bubble too.
Yeah, it's interesting, because doing research for this interview, I was on Twitter, and Twitter is not known for being kind. And people were saying wonderful things about you. So, greatest manager of all time, best GM in the league, you're the GOAT, that kind of thing. Do you pay attention to that at all? Or do you have people who monitor that for you? Or you're just like, keep my head down, do the work?
I think we're all humans, so that stuff affects us. But as much as possible, I think, again, going back to Paul and some of his teachings, I think, on the criticism side to that, and I've been on both sides, and you point out some positive ones, but you can find negative ones too. And I think that's just the case with most public figures. But when it comes to the negative side, one of the learning lessons that I, as a person of faith, I think, there's Paul's teaching about there is no condemnation for those that find themselves, rooted in God's love and in the Lord.
Wow.
And that verse or truth really took on new meaning to me through some of the criticism chapters, which is, say what you want about me, positive or negative, but especially from a condemnation standpoint, it's not going to impact me because my identity is elsewhere, and it's, if you really are living a life where your identity is being a child of God, and your source of power is in God's love and being used as an instrument in his hands, that stuff doesn't really play a big role. And it's very freeing. It's very freeing.
Yeah, it would be. And I mean, you're being thrust into the heart of some of the biggest stuff on this planet, right? So it's not like, oh yeah, we did this little tiny thing at this little, Z division school. It was like, no, this is like big league. This is big stuff. So I got to ask you, just from a strategy standpoint, and again, a lot of my leaders listening, the leaders know a lot more about this than I do, but you just come off a world championship, you win it. As you say, you're into the trade season, the free agency. Almost every commentator that I could see said that you made the team stronger. Like, you just won a world championship. Then you went out, did a whole bunch of deals. You made the team stronger. I'm curious, why did you pursue making the team even more successful? And I don't mean that to be like a simple question, but a lot of people might say, oh, we can get 2 or 3 years out of this. What was your thinking behind making all those deals?
Well, Carey, at the beginning of the interview, you told me you weren't a sports aficionado, but your questions show that you are becoming one, because that's a great insight that you saw that we made our team better. You had
just a bit of research. That's
all. It's interesting. I think it gets to the concept of complacency in leadership. I think I remember learning lessons from basketball players like Michael Jordan from the Bulls and Kobe on the Lakers. But they would often talk about, and some of these were conversations I had in person, others is just kind of learning through reading interviews and books, but how they felt like the mastery of their game would come in the off season. And here's what they meant is they would perfect a move on the court. So maybe a fadeaway jump shot or a hesitation pull-up three-pointer. These are advanced concepts, but they would create a move in the off season that they would use to destroy their opponents all season long. But then the defense and the competition catches up to that. And they say, okay, we are going to find a way to take that away. And so I think it's the same thing with team building is when you win a championship a certain way, you know that there's 30 teams in the NBA, you're one of them. So the other 29 teams are going to find ways to say, hey, how do we take away the Lakers' advantages and the way they won a championship? And so I think it's having counter moves to what you did well. And it's not strained from your core competencies and your core culture. You know, our head coach has defined our team as a defense first team. So that theme will remain. But how do we make moves around the edges, knowing that the competition is going to try to take away some of our strengths and not being complacent to just say, oh, you know, we can sit back, we won, we can continue to win, we don't need to do anything new. I think great leaders and great companies are always evolving and always reinventing parts of themselves. And I think that's one of the things that went into the thinking around going from the 2020 team that won the world championship to a 2021 team, Lakers team, that's different, but better.
Do you tend to be a leader who has do you take it season by season? And obviously at some level, I think you would have to, right? Because injuries, retirements, all that stuff plays into the mix and then what other teams do. But do you tend to think in a 2 to 3 year vision or do you have other things that you're kind of moving toward or you read those things in the moment?
I think I'm more of a fluid thinker. I think that, you know, like a game of chess or a sports game, you never know exactly how it's going to play out because different things transpire during the game. And I think with this particular line of business, to your point, there's so many unexpected things that can happen, an injury, a trade, different things can come up that I try to stay nimble and fluid in terms of all of that. That doesn't mean you're reactionary. You're always prepared. You know, we are methodically prepared when we go into an NBA draft or a trade or a trade deadline or free agency period. You know, we have reams and reams of our articulated, you know, sort of strategic blueprints and plans that have been thought through for months. So I think it's a combination of staying fluid, but also being incredibly prepared when moments come your way that you've thought through them ahead of time.
It seems to me, Rob, that you've got some great personal disciplines. You talk about getting up in the morning, reading scripture, having that quiet time, and I'm sure, you know, you look to be incredibly fit from what I can see. But I'd love to talk about the role of conditioning. It's a bit of a strange direction. I want to talk about sleep. Some of the stuff that I've read online, and feel free to correct it, is that LeBron James will spend up to $1 million, $1.5 million on conditioning, and that he'll sleep up to 12 hours a day between a solid night's sleep and a nap to prepare. Sleep's something I take really seriously and think about. So I'd love to know what you think about preparation for on-court time and preparation even for your own leadership. Can you comment on that for a little while?
Yeah, I think that level of detail and preparation is essential. I think when you meet the genius leaders, these are the 0.001 percenters. There's no detail of their life or their day that hasn't been thoughtfully, you know, unpacked, turned around, thought through with a plan. And, you know, the great players, LeBron and Michael Jordan and Magic Johnson and Kobe, it's not like they just show up and play. I mean, the systems that they have around them, from their dietary and nutritional plan, to their sleep plan, to their body recovery plans. A lot of them talk about, kind of prehab. It's not like I get injured and then I rehab, but how do I stay in front of a possible injury? I think to be truly great at anything in life, you have to pour all of yourself into it. And it is jaw-dropping to see what some of these guys do. I, of course, try to put some of those practices into, your own life with proper rest, and a proper sleep schedule and a proper nutritional schedule. And I think when you're a leader, of course, other people are going to be looking to you for guidance. And so I think it's important to kind of, live what you preach. That's just kind of how I've been. I'm more wired as probably a type A perfectionist, and that can be a gift and a curse, but
yeah,
it does kind of, but I know how important too. I'm married to more of an adventurer, on the Enneagram scale. She's more I think it's the 3 or the partier, every moment's a party. And so it's kind of a perfect, the perfect complement. And she's great at making sure I don't stay so locked in that I become robotic,
Right. Are you a 1? Do you know your type, Rob?
I would have to dig back. I think that sounds right.
Perfectionism would be a 1, but
So, but for me, it's I do have to kind of force myself into adventure and work breaks. But for me, that comes in spending time with the kids. And then I'm a very avid reader, and, fiction, nonfiction. And you talked at the beginning of, hey, how have you shaped yourself? And it's, you pull from random things. I one of my favorite novels, is Les Mis by Victor Hugo. And one of my favorite fictional characters of all time is the Bishop, and I've had patches as a leader where people have said, oh gosh, you really showed a lot of grace in this. I don't know how you've done that. And, you just think about all the things you experience in life. And as you read, and the Bishop in that story, of course, has extraordinary grace when he could, frame Jean Valjean for stealing the silver candles. But he, basically tells the police officer, no, he forgot to take these too. And it, with that moment of grace, like transforms this criminal's life into, a person that changes multitudes of other people's lives in positive ways. And, I think that's probably at the core of all of our missions, I think, as leaders, is how do we lead with those qualities?
You mentioned jaw-dropping habits of some of these players when you look at how meticulous and ridiculous they get in terms of their preparation for a game, their rhythms, routines, and habits. Without telling tales out of school, you got 1 or 2 you feel comfortable sharing, like just some really ninja practices?
Yeah, I mean, it's, I think with LeBron, you see him, he'll play a game, and then you'll see the next morning he may be in the weight room, spending an hour on his body. I mean, most people would just say, hey, I just need to rest. But like, just the way they attack things, I think, Kobe, if he would have, there's legendary stories, if he would have an off shooting game at Staples Center in Los Angeles, when all the reporters and the crowd left, he would grab the ball boy or the trainer and go back out in the darkness at night and make the shot he missed, maybe that cost the team the game, make that, 500 times before he could go to bed. So just these meticulous ways of always kind of getting ahead and striving to be great. It really is inspiring to see these guys and the level they put in, to being the best in the world at what they do.
Do you have any habits that you would say, obviously your scripture reading and your morning time, but any that you kind of say, okay, this is probably bordering on extreme, anything like that really helps you, that other people looking in might go, huh, what's that about?
You have to ask my wife that one, because she would probably make fun of half of my habits. But I think throughout the day, I tend to stay really, really busy. And so part of that's nutrition. I may, instead of sitting down for the big 2-hour celebration lunch that would make me want to take a nap at 2, I may do grab a power smoothie and, maybe some raw nuts or something and eat healthy and keep moving. But I think trying to stay adaptive and trying to be healthy and eat a lot of little things throughout the day to not bog myself down. I think, my wife and kids would make fun of me for that, but maybe that's
Favorite books, Rob? You're an avid reader. Any you would recommend? It's like, wow, if you're going to read some books this year, make sure you check these few out.
I'm sitting by my bookshelf. I think some of the authors that I've loved so much over the years, I think Philip Yancey, and Tim Keller has been amazing. C.S. Lewis, George MacDonald. I'm a big Thomas Merton fan. Dallas Willard, and his books have shaped my life. So that would be more on the sort of nonfiction. And then I just love stories and novels. And I love Dickens. The Tale of Two Cities is one of my favorites. I've mentioned Victor Hugo, Les Mis, Dostoevsky, the Brothers K. Those are stories I read over and over and find new nuggets every time I read them. But I do love to read.
That's great. Do you read leadership books as well, or you tend more towards spiritual and fiction?
Probably more towards spiritual and fiction. I do also love to read great biographies. I love.
Oh, me too.
Yeah, Nelson Mandela's autobiography is one of my favorites. Chuck Colson's biography, of course, is a classic, and one of the great stories. If you want a sports biography that is incredibly moving, Andre Agassi's Open is one of my favorite biographies of all time, and I highly recommend that one too.
Okay, I have not read that, but I've heard it recommended. I'll have to check that out. We'll link to all of those in the show notes as well. Rob, anything you want to share with leaders? I'm thinking about your point about being agile, right? Because when you really think about all the other teams making moves, your players have good years and bad years. I'd love, because I think we're moving into an agile year, and I do a lot of coaching of leaders on agility. And I think, my natural default is to find what worked and try to milk that as long as I possibly can. So trying to stay agile as a leader myself. Any final words on one or two keys to agility for leaders?
Yeah, I think part of agility in some sense, Carey, is just getting back to that mindset of emptying yourself a little bit. I mean, we are all as leaders instruments in the Creator's hands, and you've been used as an instrument to take all these different stories and lives and bring them to one place where all of us can listen to them and stay agile, because we learn. So you've been used in that way and encouraged so many people and so many leaders, and we're all so appreciative of that. And I think that's probably through a lens of you trying to figure out, what is this life all about and how did I end up here? I think for me, I grew up in a small town in Illinois, and I think to if you start like the kids, little drawings that you do when you're in grade school of taking the maze and using your pencil to go from point A to point Z. I think of my journey. How did I end up from a little town in Illinois to being the general manager of the World Championship Los Angeles Lakers? I think looking at that maze, it'd be like taking a Swiss watch and disassembling it and throwing it into the Sahara Desert, and the wind blows and all of a sudden the watch comes back together. Like that's how unlikely that journey is. And so you realize that it's only because you're an instrument in God's hands and he's weaving together a story. But I think the more we can put ourselves in that framework to start the day, we'll be agile, because then it's not the lens of like, how can I dominate and control this day? Then you're not agile. Then you're motivated by that self-voice and narcissism and all of those things. But if it's more, how can I be used as an instrument to make other people's lives better and the people that I work with, then you can stay agile. And I think that's been the key for me.
That's a really good word to young leaders too. I think it was in the Eagles Netflix documentary years ago where Joe Walsh said, and I'm paraphrasing because he was asked about his journey to success and as a member of the Eagles. And I think he said, at the time, it just felt like random chaos. But looking back on it, it's like a beautifully orchestrated poem. And I look at my life as a young leader and it's like, yeah, how did I end up here? How did I end up, interviewing you? How did you end up being a listener? How did all of that happen? I have no idea. But that idea of, oh, this looks kind of interesting. Why don't we try this for a little while? There's a lot of wisdom in that. And I think staying agile as you get older is even more of a discipline.
I love that. I love the poem metaphor. And I do think that the world wants all of us to get caught up in, what's the future hold? And, I think there's so much comfort in that, figuring out God's will for your life is not your responsibility. Like if you really start your day open and empty, that will be revealed to you. It's God's promise, right? And so it's flipping the lens, and it is. We all can be grateful that when you look in the review mirror of life, you can see those seeds of faithfulness, throughout. And it's so important, I think, to be mindful of those things, to face the uncertainties and the unpredictabilities and the fears of the future, is to look at the faithfulness in all of our past.
Well, I know we get to follow you in the papers. I know we get to follow you online through media outlets. But are you active on social? Is there a place where you tend to show up, or you just kind of do your job day to day? I guess the question I'm asking is, where can people learn more about you online?
I'm probably pretty old school, Carey, but maybe you'll have to give me some lessons about getting a little bit more active on social someday. If we continue to have success, maybe I'll open up that avenue if you could.
I love it. Rob, thanks for doing this really long press conference and all these atypical questions. It's been an absolute joy to get to know you a little bit. Thank you for reaching out and saying hey. And what a thrill to have this conversation with you.
Thanks, Carey. Continued blessings on your show. I won't listen to this one, but the ones that come after, I'll be excited to listen to.
Rob, I'm grateful.
All right. See you later.
Well, I hope today's episode was helpful to you. You can always get more by subscribing to my channel. I also have a lot more content over at CareyNieuwhof.com for leaders in business and leaders in churches. And you can get transcripts of this episode there and so much more, plus some other stuff I do for leaders. So head on over there to discover more at CareyNieuwhof.com. And in the meantime, I really hope our time together today has helped you lead like never before.